Ahaw kwe maji tayan niwi ojibwe majines mietago winda munagug migwech kinegegu yo heshchegeg minuago jiapi taindaban kinegegu heshchegengo de nindashwin wagosh hindugu minua migazi and dodem wasawad ishkonigan wen jibayan gazagasquaji mekag namanji dogish binisado tagwan ojibwe muyan. Gawin? English. All right. I was told to keep it short, 20-minute TED Talk, but they didn't say anything about using a foreign language like English. How strange, too, that with the tens of thousands of years of documented human history in this part of the world, we so often begin with the arrival of the first white guy. When you look at all of that documented human history, really all the white guy stuff is statistically insignificant. I'm really happy to be here today. Where I come from, people smarter, older, and wiser than me say when you go somewhere new, you use our language first and foremost. You tell them your name and your clan and where you're from. So I was just giving you a little Ojibwe introduction. My native name is Wagosh, which means fox, from the Eagle clan, and I'm from Leech Lake, which is in northern Minnesota. I am one of the very lucky people who gets to live and work around my home community. My family members have been buried in the very same plot of land longer than the American Philosophical Society's been in existence, and I get to live there and be there at the same time that I'm connected to the broader world and publish books and travel and so forth. I think this is one of the struggles that a lot of Indigenous communities are facing now. Of course, we are ancient and modern. We have the struggles about everything from economic vitality and political independence and even issues with substance abuse and so forth. And then at the same time that we have to navigate the broader world and we have to code switch to do it. At what point does the code switching become assimilation? How much can a people change and still be the same people? And there's no such thing as the native experience. There are many different native experiences. There are some communities where Ojibwe is the language that is used and the population of speakers grows as the population grows, in like the Severn region in Canada. And there are other communities where there are no living speakers of that given tribal language. There's such a variety of experiences, historical and contemporary linguistic ones. There's no way to encapsulate it all in a short talk like this. But I thought I'd give you a few thoughts about what's happening on the ground in some of these native communities and how that really intersects, I think, quite deeply with the work of APS. So one of the folks, one of my elders back home, he passed away a few years ago now. His name was Tom Stillday. And he was the first person who was named chaplain for the Minnesota State Senate who was not from a Judeo-Christian background. So he'd open up the State Senate with a feather war bonnet and his pipe. And he was a great hoot, too, because he'd say, "I'm praying for politicians, and boy, do they need it." More than ever these days. And one time we brought him to Bemidji State University to give the graduation banquet speech, for which he broke all the rules for a graduation banquet speech, because those are to be short, a couple good jokes, focus on the students. And I think he was about an hour and a half into his remarks before he said his first words in English, which were, "All you people who study Indians, study that." And he went and sat down. So I, of course, was highly entertained. But he had some really good points. So often, the books that have been written about Native people have been written by non-Native people who've hardly talked to one. And then the sources that were used are usually what the Army chaplain's writing in his journal or something like that. They really don't have a lot of Native voices or perspectives. And from everything from the academic enterprise to our contemporary efforts to develop anything from a suicide prevention plan to an economic development initiative, we often get somebody from the outside coming in saying, we know better than you what's best for you. Using a data set from a totally different population, expecting the same results for this population, and then scratching their heads saying, how come we have all these problems? Why isn't that working? So it's imperative that we actually have Native people deeply engaged in and leading the work. And there's plenty of room for partnership. I'm stunned at some of the very positive developments that have been happening in Indigenous language revitalization. 30 years ago in Hawaii, the Indigenous language was illegal for use in public schools, and they were down to 1,000 speakers, half of whom lived in one isolated community, and the other half scattered across the rest of the islands. Today, there are over 20,000 speakers. Over 3,000 have learned it as their first language in the home, tripling the number of first speakers. And there are about 20 Hawaiian medium schools. It's pretty stunning to see what has happened. The efforts with Mohawk, Ojibwe, Cherokee, Blackfeet are starting to gain some momentum, and with others as well. And it's really interesting to see what has been happening and what really can happen. As a matter of perspective, like if I put up my finger and said, what is this? I could start a fight oftentimes if I didn't clarify in what language, right? Like in the language of body parts, well, it's a finger, right? But in the language of numbers, 1, in the language of space, up, and in the language of frequent public speaking, I got to go to the bathroom. So who's right? And they're all right. They're all right. This is what happens in our politics, too. Somebody's up there talking about race, and they're saying, this here's a finger, it's not an elbow, it's not a toe. The rest of you people, shh. And somebody's listening, that's a 1, not a 2. See, they just don't understand. If we can see things from multiple perspectives, how much more powerful we really are. How much better equipped we are to solve these big problems. So, to me, the work with languages is vital. It's vital for Native people, for our own identity, health, well-being, success, and so forth, but it's vital for everyone else. No one's got a monopoly on knowledge. Nobody's got a monopoly on perspectives. You know, we should take everybody we want to give a good talking to and give them a good listening to. And it's pretty amazing what we can learn doing things like that. All right. So there are a lot of reasons why Indigenous languages are important. I think some of them are pretty obvious to those of you in this room. All languages hold a unique worldview. One of the things I find really interesting about Ojibwe, my language, is that unlike English, which is heavily influenced by many other languages, right? It's a Germanic language, that's its structural form, but there's lots of Latin, Greek, there are even like 20 Ojibwe words that are in everyday English usage, and it tends to pick up and collect things. So you kind of have to know a little Latin to really understand that sarcasm means to tear the flesh, right? Chasm, to tear, and sark is flesh. And then you got a little deeper meaning behind a word. In Ojibwe, the morphemes, the smallest meaningful parts of words, tend to be known to everyday speakers. So things like lexical expansion for new technologies is actually a little bit easier to do because you can just describe what you see. There's a TV. Oh, Mazanate Sijigan. It's a box that reflects an image through light. But you'll often hear good speakers of Ojibwe say, first of all, it's funnier in Ojibwe because you have 2 meanings, right? There's the thick description, and then there's what we associate the word with. And then it's like you're painting a picture because there's this deeper description and meaning that goes with things. So, for example, in Ojibwe, the word for an elder, Gichiaya'a, literally means great being. The word for an elderly woman, Mindemuye, means one who holds things together, describes the role of the family matriarch. Now in English, we got old woman, elderly woman, aged woman, hag, right? And languages both reflect the worldview of a people and shape the worldview of a people. So how many elders do we got on the cover of Cosmo? Right? In our way, there is a beauty in every age. We talk about like 4 seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter, 4 cycles of life. Children are beautiful, young people are beautiful, adults are beautiful, elders are beautiful. But somehow, language can have a more expansive or limiting view of what beauty and value is. So there's just a different way of looking at things. If you're speaking in Ojibwe, you don't have to say something like, respect your elders. It's kind of built right in with any word you could possibly use. And there are many, many more examples. We'll have time for questions and answers, and I'm happy to take you deeper into anything that you're interested in. A language, too, is a tool that is used to carry forward cultural norms and traditions. And there are so many of these things that I'm kind of stunned at, in spite of the 500 pretty rough years that our people have experienced, how much we still have. A lot of people talk about the last of the blank and then fill in the blank, right? And if it's not like physical death, at least it's cultural death, and all you'll have left are the notes in the bookcases, right? And this is a deeply enculturated way of looking at Indigenous communities throughout the world. I remember one time I was giving a talk in France, and it seemed like people never got too excited at academic talks in France, but there was a guy who was, really excited. And, okay, what's your question? Monsieur, where are the real Indians? And I said, where are the real Indians? Where are the real Frenchmen? Because there's a castle across the road, but there's nobody living in it. Right? I don't see people riding up and down the street on horses with banners for Charlemagne. I don't even see berets and little pipes. Where are the real Frenchmen? And he's kind of... And then, of course, it dawned on him that some stereotype about what it means to be French is not what it means to be French, that it's more connected in connection to France and the language that is French, and a Frenchman can be French even traveling in China. I was like, well, exactly. It's like that for us, too. We get to change over time, but these things, this connection to land and to language, it's vital and important and formative for identity. So, it's important for worldview, it's important for cultural norms, and it's the problems, when I look at the things that are going wrong in some Native communities, it's we're right where we should be, having been through all the crap that we've been through. But it's also quite amazing how much we still have of our cultural traditions. Sometimes it's hard for people to figure me out because I'm an academic guy and I publish books and I travel a lot and I'm well-spoken and so forth. But I also choose to live where I do for a lot of different reasons. It has not hampered my success. I've had offers that triple my salary and things like that at other big institutions, but I spend a lot of my time harvesting wild rice and making maple syrup and sugar. I've got 9 kids. I've been busy. And 4 grandkids now. They've been busy. And so we do these activities that keep us a little more recognizable to our ancestors. And it is so interesting and I think quite beautiful and formative for me to be engaged in that effort. When we do our questions and answers, if you want to know, well, what do you do aside from harvest? Like, what are your ceremonies and your cultural round really like? And I'm happy to take you a little deeper into that to give you some sense of that. Language is an important part of sovereignty. It really is. If we become assimilated, thoroughly assimilated with the ruling class, it's a lot harder to justify our existence, right? Between the issues of tribal enrollment, our increasingly, for everybody, multiracial backgrounds. They're just profound challenges for maintaining the independence and vitality of Native nations. But a living language is one of the things that inescapably describes and supports that. A lot of folks are really struggling too to figure out, how do we help Native people do better? In my own experience, and like all humans, I'm a complicated person. So my father's actually not Native. He's an Austrian Jewish immigrant, Holocaust survivor, spoke nothing but German the first 13 years of his life. And eventually made his way to Minnesota, met my mom, and here I am. My mother grew up in a little village called Bena on the Leech Lake Reservation, population 400. Where still the, average household income is around $20,000 a year. And when my folks were getting started, there were some humble times, like a hand pump, an outhouse, no electricity, pick wild rice, trade with the white farmers down the road, for milk and eggs kind of things. But by the time I hit middle school, my mother had become the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota, built a nice house. The economic profile for our family started to change, and it revealed the importance and power of education. But unfortunately, our educational system, having been developed by white folk for the education of white folk, does a pretty good job of helping empower and teach white folk, and it's not doing so well for everybody else. I would say that our educational system is still a white empowerment program. If you are an Indigenous learner, chances are you will never have an Indigenous teacher, and you will never have anything in the curriculum that will teach you who you are and how your people help make the world a great and wonderful place. And it generates powerful disengagement. Think about this. A little over half of the students of color in the United States of America finish high school. Even though that cohort of students comprises now the majority of the K-12 students in the United States of America. And with all of the well-known data that proves that education is a powerful lever that helps you gain access to opportunity. Doesn't guarantee it, doesn't make the world a fair place, but it's a powerful lever, that we have an educational system that is taking the largest demographic group of students in America and is failing them, which means it is harder for them to become full load-bearing citizens with good jobs paying taxes, and increases the chances that they will need extra help rather than be providing the help. It's not a good recipe for a healthy nation. Even if we had equity today, and we don't, our educational system, with its racial disparities, will engineer the racially predictable economic disparities that we have. So I'm really happy to report that the first Ojibwe immersion school, which was actually created in Wisconsin, even though Native kids across the country have like a 50% pass rate in their tests in English and math, has a 100% pass rate in the tests in English and math for the first 15 years of operation. If somebody's figuring something out, maybe we should pay more attention to that. There's a lot more to say about the school. I've done a lot of work with them, and I'm happy to share more if you want to do more there too. In my own work, with the assassination of Hole in the Day or Warrior Nation, I've tried very hard to get the archives and the Indians talking to each other, and I really do believe it can show historians a different way to conduct their craft. And there are so many tools that can contribute to our work. So, one of Boaz's early students, William Jones, who's actually a fluent speaker of Meskwaki and ended up doing a lot of work with Ojibwe, and they're both in the same language family, but so is English and German. They're not the same language. So it's just stunning to think about what Jones went through. And eventually, Boaz convinced him to head off to Papua New Guinea, where he ended up in someone's pot. But his contributions in the Ojibwe linguistic world, that's a true story, in the Ojibwe linguistic world are still of great relevance and value for us today. It's not just the preservation of texts, although it does that, but it is something we actively use to reinforce and deepen our understanding of Ojibwe syntax and literature and poetry. And so we have, his works have been, published and then retranscribed, and there are numerous linguists and Ojibwe folks who are working on those in all kinds of ways. So those stories are actually told at this immersion school through the work of William Jones. And it's just pretty incredible to see its real relevant and relatable value in Native communities today. So it's not just the glass case. It's so much more. And the emerging academic work and just basic curricular development work is all fed by this sort of material. I feel like this is a time of great tests for all of us. Essentially, when you go back to the dawning of the agricultural age about 9,000 years ago, all human beings across the planet tended to be a little more communally focused with earth-based philosophical perspectives and religious traditions and so forth. And you can look at Jared Diamond's Gun, Germs, and Steel, or even Daniel Quinn's book, Ishmael, to get a sense for how this stuff started to really change. But coming out of the Fertile Crescent in the Middle East, you had a very unique cultural development. And the production of food so much more efficiently enabled us to do all kinds of positive and negative things. Positive things like academic enterprise and the development of libraries, right? And negative things like wage war far more efficiently. And we ended up with colonialism. And that is something that has thoroughly dehumanized everyone. Sure, it sucks worse to be the victim of a colonial experience, but the perpetrators too have been thoroughly dehumanized. Think about the experience of white men who comprise the majority of the serial killers and school shooters and so forth. That the colonial experience has left lots of damage for us all to wade through. Our commodification of the planet and all of its resources, where we keep doing things, essentially, to me, it amounts to like burning our house down to stay warm in the winter, as we keep mortgaging our future for short-term corporate profits. And although there's no way to structure societies the way they were 9,000 years ago, there are more than vestigial remnants of different ways of looking at the world in Indigenous communities, things that should pollinate everybody's garden. They're embedded in our languages and our ways of doing things, and we have a lot to share with the rest of the world, but we also have, when you look at the tests that we are going through as a nation and as a planet, that it's things like democracy are a pretty new way of structuring a society. It's not been thoroughly tested, but we're getting some tests now. And the test cannot be that democracy is successful when it successfully homogenizes its population, but when it can not just tolerate, but actually support a diversity of thought, perspective, and language. So with that, I want to say miigwech. Thank you very much for your kind time and attention, and I'll stick around for questions. Miigwech. Can we stay up here or go down?
Yes, we have questions.
Hi, Linda Greenhouse from New Haven. So you talk from the experience of a community whose language never disappeared.
Right.
And I wonder if you can tell us, if you know, about the experience of the Native communities whose language has been lost, is being rediscovered, recreated by scholars. How meaningful is that? How possible is that to recreate that communal sense that you spoke from? Or is it always going to remain to some degree the notes in a vitrine?
Yeah, that's a good question. In just the United States and Canada, we've gone from over 500 tribal languages that are actively spoken down to 183 now. Of those, only 20 are spoken by children. So that tells you where we're looking. And really, of those, 4 are spoken by so many people that they'll definitely be here 100 years from now, regardless of what we do. The others, it kind of depends on the depth and breadth of any interventions to keep them going and growing. So that's all pretty sobering to hear. There are examples, like you can look at Hebrew, right? Unspoken for 2,000 years, that was brought back. But really, if you brought somebody from 2,000 years ago to Israel to talk to somebody, it's not quite the same thing, right? That doesn't mean there was no value to doing that. It was so fundamentally vital for, Jewish and Israeli identity and connection and so many things. And there too, you still have the ability to have modern Hebrew carry thoughts and worldview that is distinct and different, from what they would be in English. But that was also a huge lift. That took a major concentrated effort from lots of people. And, the textualization of that language really made that possible, even though it's distinct and different. So, obviously, the strongest, best, and most productive way to do it is to keep a language alive while it's still here. But for those for whom that's not an option, and there are many who don't have that as an option, then you do what you can. We just gave the MacArthur Prize a few years ago to somebody working with Wampanoag who was, essentially trying to use these sorts of texts and early missionary grammars and things like that to piece together, a patchwork quilt that would enable people to access Indigenous thought and language, and it's very important for a lot of people in that place. And, although Native people must and have to be able to change over time, even the Amish have a hard time going Amish. You know what I mean? Like, to wall a culture off and try to freeze it in time is really difficult. And a lot of the issues we're running into is just the proliferation of things like mainstream media in a handful of dominant world languages, and the movement of human populations and things like that. So I do feel like all efforts are worthwhile, and there are so many things that feed identity. I probably have about 20 things on the top of my brain that feed our identity. Language is one. Cultural traditions, connections to place, race, all these different things, our educational systems, our political systems, and all of those things are being challenged very much by, in Native communities. So, yeah, another interesting way to look at it is you could talk to the Seminole, who are one of the most financially successful tribes in the United States. They own the Hard Rock Cafe enterprise, operate businesses in many different countries, and they've eliminated poverty for their entire tribal citizenry. But if you ask them what keeps you up at night, they will always say language and culture loss. So these are really important and vital things. You can look at even like in a place like Spain with the Basque population, and people are holding on to what they can. And sometimes from the outside, it looks like all they got left are some red berets. If they look, talk, and act so much like the broader population in Spain. For Basque people, of course, it's much more than that, right? But the more of those things we can keep going, the better and stronger and richer we will all be, right? It says something positive about a place like the United States of America if it does not succeed in obliterating everything and everyone else into some homogenous group, right?
Erwin Shapiro, Cambridge, Massachusetts. I thought it was a fascinating talk, and I appreciate it very much. I was curious how, for your pre-college education in Ojibwe, how you developed textbooks of the history of the Ojibwe, what do you use? I assume there was not a written language that you have for 1,000 years of
Right.
data. How do you go about developing history courses for the students?
Yes, good
Things like
question.
that.
So I can talk about developing language materials and developing history materials both. First of all, it's true that the Ojibwe was not a written language. We had a system of writing on birch bark, but they were mnemonic devices where a symbol would be associated, with a deer or a waterfall, but it wasn't a written language per se. So really the first efforts to do that were, of course, missionaries doing work in indigenous languages in our area that started to develop writing systems. We have a couple of writing systems active now, and some were developed actually as early as even in the 1600s. Some were being worked on. Although the most widely used one for Ojibwe now was really developed in the 1940s. And I think, ultimately, unless we're going to go Amish and wall ourselves off from the rest of the world and try to freeze culture in time, then we have to get the Xbox and the TV and everything else operating in our language. And so I think that has to be the direction that we move in. We do all kinds of stuff. So, we intentionally engage in lexical expansion so we can talk about anything that's in a curriculum, in our language. We want to develop the operating system for iPhone for Ojibwe, as they've already done for Cherokee and Mohawk and others. I would classify our efforts really as emergent. We don't just want to take Mother Goose rhymes and tape over the English words and crunch our language into English thought patterns. We want to have our own literature for every kind of age level and so forth. And so we're working on it. It's a lot of work, but I'm not that old. I'm pushing 50 now. When I started, we could have counted the number of Ojibwe books on two hands, and now there's so many hundreds I couldn't even tell you what they all are. And I'm certainly one of a great many people who are working on this stuff. With regard to history, it's a whole different field and discipline, but it's connected to the language work. And, ultimately, I think we've had some blinders on in the discipline of history, and I'm formally trained as a historian, so that's what my PhD is actually in history, and I've kind of worked with language to feed that work and done a lot of linguistic work too, but ultimately, we've had our blinders on because we've only looked at non-Indigenous sources to describe the Indigenous experience, and of course we're missing so much. And with our group, there have been some really cool things done. Minnesota is one of the best state historical societies in the country, and there was a guy, William Warren, who was doing Ojibwe oral histories in the 1800s and stuff like that. And so there's some really rich texts that are there that really are quite authentic. And it's amazing what we can find. Like when I was doing the assassination of Hole in the Day, you could read the chaplain's journal that said there was this Fort Ripley in central Minnesota, and Hole in the Day was threatening to come attack the fort and burn it down. And the chaplain's writing, we're all going to die. So here come Ojibwe warriors from the next community at Mille Lacs, and they surround the fort, face out to protect it from Hole in the Day, another Ojibwe chief. All that you can get from the chaplain's journal. But none of the really interesting answers, which would be like, why? So in speaking to Melvin Eagle, who's an elder from Mille Lacs, I was talking to him about this history. And he said, oh, I'll tell you why. That was my grandfather that brought the warriors from Mille Lacs over there. And here's what he told my dad and me. And all of a sudden, we had some answers about why. So the archives and the Indians speaking to each other. And of course, it was stronger than a standard, what we would call primary source documented historical work. And I think we need to do a lot more of that. Depending on where you're looking, there could be really vast and rich stuff. Even the name for a place can be really loaded and rich. Like where I live in Bemidji, it's the northernmost part of the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi River doesn't just flow south. It goes in a big loop like this. There's 4 continental divides, and water flows in 4 directions from there. And so the current cuts across this little corner of the lake. So Bemidji-Gamog means where the current cuts across, and describes this unique geographical feature. And when you start digging into the names for every person and place and thing, it gives you a depth of understanding that is beyond what you would find in a standard archive. They can feed each other. Okay, thank you. Thanks.